2 months ago, I watched a service advisor point at a compression printout and tell a customer his 4-cylinder needed a full valve seal job. $1,600. Parts and labor, because the engine was, in his words, burning oil, and there was nothing to do about that except to replace the seals. The customer paid for it. 3 weeks later, I watched a different mechanic run the exact same complaint on a car with almost the identical wear pattern, blue smoke on cold start, oil disappearing between changes, the same kind of code sitting in the computer, and instead of quoting a $1,600 repair, he handed the owner an $11 bottle and told him to go drive on the highway for 45 minutes. 2 weeks and 2 more drives later, the smoke was gone. Oil consumption dropped to almost nothing. No part is replaced, no shop time billed. And before you assume that engine just had a smaller problem, it didn't. It's because before you let anyone replace a single part on an engine that's burning oil, there is one boring, cheap, decades-old test almost nobody runs first, and skipping it is exactly how ordinary people end up paying for repairs their engine never actually needed. I want to be straight with you before we go any further, because this topic is drowning in videos that promise a magic bottle stops oil burning forever, no diagnosis required, and that promise is not true. It was never true. If your engine is burning oil because the internal parts are genuinely worn out, no additive fixes that permanently. And if a video tells you otherwise, it is lying to you for a click. What is true, documented for decades in restoration shops and independent garages, and confirmed by actual mechanics who will tell you this off the record, is that a huge percentage of oil burning complaints are not actually caused by worn parts at all. They're caused by parts that work fine but are temporarily stuck. And stuck is a completely different problem than worn, with a completely different price tag attached to it. Today I'm going to show you exactly how to tell which one you have and exactly what to do about the fixable one, because getting this distinction wrong is worth thousands of dollars. And I want to say one more thing before we get into the mechanics of it, because it matters how you use this information. This isn't a promise that your engine is fine. Some engines really are worn out, and no video, no bottle, no clever trick changes that. What this is a way to find out which situation you're actually in before you hand over your credit card. Because right now, the entire system is built around skipping that question and going straight to the expensive answer. Let's start with what's actually happening inside your engine when it burns oil, because almost nobody explains this part correctly. Every piston in your engine has a set of thin metal rings wrapped around it, usually 3 per cylinder. 2 of those rings exist to seal the combustion chamber, so the explosion above the piston pushes it down instead of leaking past it. The 3rd ring, sitting lower on the piston, has one job only, and that job is scraping excess oil off the cylinder wall on the way down so it doesn't end up in the combustion chamber and burn. When all 3 rings are doing their job, a thin, controlled film of oil stays where it belongs, lubricating the cylinder wall, and almost none of it gets burned. Valve seals do a similar job at the other end of the engine. Tiny rubber or synthetic collars that sit around the valve stems and stop oil from seeping down into the intake and exhaust ports where it has no business being. When either of those seals loses its grip, or when that oil control ring stops scraping the way it's supposed to, oil finds its way into the combustion chamber, gets burned along with the fuel, and comes out your tailpipe as a thin blue haze, especially noticeable right after a cold start, or right after you've been sitting at idle for a while. There's actually a 3rd path oil can take into your combustion process, and it's worth mentioning even though it's not the main focus of this video, because it's easy to confuse with the ring and seal problem. If your car is turbocharged, the turbo itself spins on a shaft supported by its own set of seals, and those seals are doing a similar job at a much higher temperature and a much higher rotational speed than anything happening down at the pistons. When a turbo seal starts to wear, oil gets pulled into the intake side of the turbo and burned right along with your fuel and air mixture, and it can look almost identical to a ring or valve seal problem from the driver's seat. Same blue smoke, same disappearing oil. The difference is that turbo seal wear is a mechanical wear issue from the start. There's no carbon-locked version of it, and no amount of penetrating oil in your crankcase reaches a seal spinning inside a turbocharger housing. If you drive a turbocharged car, it's worth ruling that out specifically before you assume what we're about to walk through applies to you. Here's where it gets interesting, and here's the part your service advisor almost never explains. There are 2 completely different reasons a ring or a seal stops doing its job. The first reason is the one everybody assumes, and the one shops love to quote you for, which is that the part is physically worn out. Metal fatigue, thinning, hardening, actual material loss from tens of thousands of miles of friction and heat. That kind of wear cannot be reversed by anything you pour in a bottle. It requires the seal or the ring to be physically replaced, and depending on what's involved, that's a real bill, typically somewhere between $800 and $2,000 just for valve seal work, and considerably more, often between $2,500 and $7,500 on a four-cylinder, if the rings themselves need replacing as part of a proper rebuild. Nobody's disputing that number when it's the real cause. That's a legitimate repair for a legitimate problem. But there's a second reason those rings stop sealing properly, and it has nothing to do with wear at all. Over years of driving, especially years of short trips, stop and go traffic, and an engine that rarely gets to fully warm up and stay warm, carbon deposits build up in the tight grooves where those rings sit. That carbon isn't soft and harmless. It bakes into something closer to a hard varnish, and when enough of it packs into the ring groove, it physically prevents the ring from moving the way it's designed to move, springing outward against the cylinder wall to maintain a tight seal. A ring that's carboned into its groove behaves exactly like a worn-out ring from the engine's perspective. It leaks oil into the combustion chamber. It shows up as blue smoke. It shows up as declining compression on a test. It shows up as an oil consumption number that makes a service advisor reach for the word rebuild. And here's the part that should make you angry if you've ever paid for this repair unnecessarily. A stuck ring and a worn ring can look almost identical on a basic diagnostic, but one of them can often be freed with an $11 bottle of penetrating oil in some patients, and the other one genuinely needs a machine shop. It's also worth understanding why carbon builds up in that specific spot in the first place, because it explains why some engines get hit with this and others almost never do. Every time your engine fires, a small amount of unburned fuel and combustion byproduct ends up coating the cylinder wall and the top of the piston. In an engine that regularly reaches full operating temperature and stays there for a sustained stretch, most of that residue gets burned off cleanly before it has a chance to harden. In an engine that mostly does short trips, the engine warms up just enough to get you to your destination and then shuts off before it's ever had a real chance to cook that residue away, and it slowly bakes into a harder, stickier layer instead. Do that every day for a few years, and you end up with a ring groove packed tightly enough that the ring can no longer move freely, even though the ring itself hasn't lost any material at all. That's the entire mechanism behind why this is fixable in a way that actual wear isn't. The metal is intact. It's just buried. This isn't some fringe theory I'm pulling out of nowhere. Old school restoration shops, the kind of places that bring 40 and 50-year-old engines back to life, have used this exact trick for as long as those shops have existed, usually with a product called Marvel Mystery Oil or a similar penetrating treatment like Seafoam. And if you ask a mechanic who's been doing this for 30 or 40 years whether they keep a jug of one of these products around, most of them will tell you, yes, usually in a container, far bigger than the little bottle sold at the parts counter because they go through a lot of it. Independent mechanics have documented for decades pulling engines apart expecting catastrophic wear, and instead finding rings that were simply glued into their grooves with baked-on carbon, completely intact underneath, completely capable of sealing properly once that carbon was broken down and cleared away. This is not a secret formula. It's an old, unglamorous trick that never went away because it keeps working on the specific problem it was designed for. So how do you actually tell which one you're dealing with before you spend $1? There are 3 signs worth paying attention to, and none of them require special tools. The first is how the oil burning started. Wear from a worn ring or a hardened valve seal is almost always gradual, a little more oil disappearing every few thousand miles over a long stretch of time. Carbon-locked rings, on the other hand, often show up more suddenly, especially after a long period of short trips, a long period of sitting unused, or after the car was recently driven hard after a long stretch of gentle, low-speed driving. If your oil consumption jumped noticeably rather than crept up slowly, that's a point in favor of a fixable, stuck condition rather than genuine wear. The second sign is mileage pattern paired with maintenance history. An engine that's had consistently short trips, lots of idling, and infrequent highway driving is a strong candidate for carbon buildup in general because the engine rarely reaches and holds the temperature needed to burn that carbon off naturally. The third sign, and the most useful one if you have access to it, is a compression test done twice, once cold and once after the engine's been driven hard for 15 or 20 minutes on the highway. If your compression numbers improve noticeably after that hard drive, especially if 1 or 2 cylinders jump up while others stay flat, that's a very strong signal you're looking at rings that are simply stuck, not rings that are gone. There's a fourth thing worth checking too, and it costs nothing but a look under the hood, which is your air filter and your recent driving pattern together. A dirty air filter richens the fuel mixture and pushes more unburned fuel past the rings than normal, which accelerates exactly the kind of carbon buildup we're talking about. So if your air filter hasn't been changed in a long time and your driving has been mostly short trips, the odds shift even further toward a fixable, carbon-related cause rather than straightforward wear. Assuming your engine looks like a reasonable candidate, here's the actual process. And I want to walk through this carefully because doing it wrong wastes your time and doing it right costs you almost nothing. Before you touch anything, check your oil condition. Pull the dipstick. If your oil is dark, low, or clearly overdue for a change, do that first. Running this process on old degraded oil just recoats the same surfaces you're trying to clean, and you'll waste the treatment. This entire approach assumes your engine is in otherwise reasonable shape and simply needs help with carbon, not a car that's been neglected for years. Once your oil is fresh, there are two versions of this fix, a gentler one and a more aggressive one, and I'd recommend starting with the gentle version first. For the gentle version, at your next oil change, instead of using 5 full quarts of regular oil, replace one of those quarts with a penetrating treatment like Marvel Mystery Oil, which runs around $10 to $12 a quart at most auto parts stores, not the $1 some videos will tell you, because that number simply isn't real. That 1 quart mixed into your regular oil is enough to start circulating a solvent through your entire oiling system with every single revolution of the engine, slowly softening whatever carbon is built up around your rings and in your valve train. Drive the car normally for the next few hundred miles. Not babied, not thrashed, just normal driving, including a real highway stretch if you can manage one, because heat and oil flow together are what actually do the work here. At your next oil change, if the smoke and consumption have improved but not fully resolved, repeat the process. Most people who've had success with this needed somewhere between 2 and 4 oil change cycles before they saw the full result, not one. So don't give up after a single try and decide it doesn't work. If the gentle version hasn't done enough after a couple of cycles, there's a more direct version, and I want to be honest that this one takes more care. This involves pulling your spark plugs and pouring a small amount, roughly 1 to 2 ounces, directly into each cylinder through the spark plug hole, then letting the engine sit completely untouched, ideally overnight, so that treatment sits directly on top of the piston where the carbon actually lives, instead of getting diluted through 5 quarts of oil first. The next morning, before you try to start the engine, turn it over by hand or bump the starter briefly with the plugs still out to help clear excess fluid from the cylinders. Because liquid doesn't compress, and you do not want to try to start an engine with liquid sitting on top of a piston. Reinstall your plugs, start the car, and expect a rough idle and some smoke for the first few minutes as the excess burns off. This version works faster and more directly than the gentle version, but it's not something I'd recommend on an engine you haven't already tried the simpler method on first, because it's more aggressive and it deserves more attention to doing it correctly. A couple of cautions are worth repeating here because skipping them is where people get themselves into trouble. Never attempt to start the engine with that fluid still sitting on top of the pistons without turning it over by hand or with the plugs out first, because liquid sitting in a cylinder does not compress the way air does. And forcing a piston up against it can bend a connecting rod, which turns a cheap fix into an expensive one in about half a second. Don't use more than the recommended 1 to 2 ounces per cylinder, because the goal is a controlled soak, not flooding the combustion chamber. And if your engine has been sitting for a very long time, months or longer, or if you already know you have a cracked or leaking head gasket, coolant getting into a cylinder changes the chemistry of what's coating that piston entirely. And no penetrating oil treatment addresses that. That's a different repair, and pouring more fluid into a cylinder with a coolant leak wastes your time and your money. How do you know if any of this actually worked? Give it time before you judge the result, because your car's computer doesn't instantly recognize an improvement. It runs its own monitoring cycles over your next several drives before it updates anything, so don't expect a smoking gun the same day. What you're watching for instead is the blue haze on cold start becoming lighter and eventually disappearing, oil levels staying steadier between changes instead of dropping fast. And if you have access to one, a compression test showing your low cylinders climbing back up toward the healthy ones instead of staying flat. Some people notice the idle smoothing out too, since a cylinder with a properly sealing ring contributes evenly to combustion instead of dragging the average down. None of these signs happen instantly, and none of them happen if the underlying cause was actual wear instead of carbon. Which brings me to the part of this video that matters just as much as the fix itself, knowing when to stop trying this and call it what it is. There's also a simple way to double-check your own eyes, if you're not fully trusting the smoke test alone. Buy a cheap paper funnel or a piece of clean white cloth and hold it a foot or so behind your exhaust tip during a cold start, well clear of the hot metal, obviously, and look at what collects. A healthy exhaust leaves it mostly dry with maybe a faint film. Heavy oil burning leaves a noticeably oily, slightly bluish residue you can see and feel. Do that once before you start the treatment, and once again after your second or third oil change cycle, and you'll have a simple before and after comparison that doesn't rely on memory or guesswork. I'll also say plainly that this isn't instant gratification content, and if you're the kind of person who wants a same-day miracle, this specific fix isn't going to feel satisfying, because the honest version of this process takes a few weeks and a few oil changes to fully show itself. That's actually part of how you can tell the difference between someone giving you real information and someone selling you a bottle with a picture of a shiny engine on the label. Real fixes for real carbon buildup take a little time because you're asking a solvent to slowly work through hardened deposits, not instantly dissolve them the moment it touches metal. If you've run the gentle version for 2 or 3 full oil change cycles and the highway version once or twice with no meaningful change at all, that's meaningful information, not a reason to keep throwing more bottles at the problem. At that point, you're very likely looking at genuine wear rather than a stuck ring, and no amount of penetrating oil is going to change that because you cannot dissolve metal that's already gone. The same applies if your valve seals are the actual culprit rather than your rings. Valve seals are small rubber or synthetic parts, and once they've hardened and cracked from age and heat, that damage is permanent. No additive restores flexibility to a seal that's already brittle. The same way, no amount of oil makes an old rubber band stretchy again once it's dried out. If that's your situation, the honest path forward is valve seal replacement, typically $800 to $2,000 depending on your engine layout, or if the rings themselves are genuinely worn rather than stuck, a proper rebuild, which on a common 4-cylinder engine usually runs somewhere between $2,500 and $7,500, depending on how much of the engine needs to come apart, and considerably more on a 6 or 8-cylinder. A full engine replacement, if it comes to that, averages somewhere in the range of $6,000 to $14,000 depending on your vehicle. Those aren't scary numbers. They're just what the actual repair costs when the actual cause is wear, and there's no honest version of this video that tells you an $11 bottle replaces a machine shop. So why doesn't every shop walk you through this distinction before quoting you a repair? It's worth saying clearly that most mechanics aren't doing this to take advantage of you. A lot of diagnostic work in a shop follows a flow chart, and that flow chart usually says oil consumption plus low compression equals seals or rings, schedule the repair. There's no line item on a work order for try an old penetrating oil trick and see what happens over the next 3 oil changes. Because that's not billable labor, it doesn't fit neatly into a service estimate, and frankly, plenty of newer technicians simply weren't taught the difference between stuck and worn, because it's the kind of thing that gets passed down from an older mechanic who's seen it firsthand, not something covered in a standard training manual. That doesn't make the $1,600 quote a scam. It means the flowchart skipped a cheap, slow test in favor of a fast, expensive one, and it's on you to ask the question before you approve the repair. There's also a simpler business reality sitting underneath all of this, and it's not some conspiracy, it's just how a repair shop makes money. A shop gets paid for parts and labor, it doesn't get paid for telling you to buy an $11 bottle and come back in 3 oil changes to see if it worked. That's not a knock on any individual mechanic. Most of the ones I've talked to about this are perfectly willing to mention it if you ask directly. Some even keep a bottle in the shop for their own cars. But nobody's volunteering a slower, cheaper path over a faster, more profitable one by default. Me, in the same way, you wouldn't expect a furniture store to bring up secondhand listings before showing you what's on their own floor. The information isn't hidden from you. It's just never the first thing offered, and that's on you to ask about. If you want to avoid ever having this conversation with a service advisor in the first place, there's a simple habit that prevents most carbon buildup before it ever becomes a problem worth diagnosing. The root cause of almost all of this is an engine that spends most of its life running short trips, idling, and never reaching a sustained operating temperature for long enough to burn off the carbon that naturally forms as a byproduct of combustion. If your driving is mostly short hops to the store and back, try to get your car onto the highway for 20 or 30 minutes at a real cruising speed at least once a week. That alone does a huge amount of the same self-cleaning work as the additive treatment, just slower and for free. If your schedule genuinely doesn't allow for that kind of driving, running a penetrating treatment through your oil every few oil changes, even preventively, before you're seeing any smoke at all, keeps carbon from ever accumulating to the point where it can lock a ring in the first place. It's maintenance at that point, not a rescue mission. And maintenance is always the cheaper version of this conversation. One more habit worth mentioning while we're here, because it directly affects how much oil ends up where it shouldn't. Your engine's positive crankcase ventilation system, the PCV valve, routes gases from inside your engine block back into the intake to be burned instead of vented into the atmosphere. When that valve gets gummed up or sticks, pressure inside the engine builds up in a way it isn't supposed to, and that extra pressure pushes oil past seals and rings that would otherwise be sealing just fine. It's a small, inexpensive part, usually well under $50 including labor, and checking it or replacing it as part of routine maintenance is one of the easiest ways to make sure you're not creating an oil consumption problem that has nothing to do with your rings or your seals at all. If you're chasing an oil burning complaint and nobody's mentioned checking this part, ask about it before you approve anything more expensive. Fuel quality plays a smaller but real role too. Gasoline that meets the higher detergency standard known as top tier contains more deposit control additive than the federal minimum requires, and consistently using a top-tier fuel reduces how much combustion residue builds up on your pistons and valves in the first place, which means less material available to bake into your ring grooves over time. It's not going to undo years of carbon on its own, but paired with occasional highway driving and a penetrating treatment every so often, It's one more piece of a routine that keeps this from ever becoming a $1,600 conversation. Going back to where we started, that $11 bottle and that 45-minute drive didn't fix a car with a small, easy problem. It fixed the exact same complaint the $1,600 quote was written for, on an engine with a comparable wear pattern, because the actual cause turned out to be carbon, not metal loss. That's not a guarantee it'll work on your car. If your rings or your seals are genuinely worn, this video just saved you the time of trying something that won't help, and told you honestly what the real number looks like instead. But if what you're dealing with is stuck, not worn, this is the cheapest, most boring test in the entire automotive world. And it deserves to be run before anyone hands you a repair estimate with 3 zeros on it. Try the oil change version first. Give it a real chance over a couple of cycles. Watch your smoke and your oil level instead of expecting an overnight miracle. And if it doesn't move at all after a fair try, you'll know for certain you're dealing with actual wear. And you can go into that repair conversation with real information instead of a guess. Either outcome puts you in a stronger position than where you started. Because right now, without that test, you're just trusting a printout and a quote to tell you something they were never actually designed to prove on their own. Tell me in the comments what your oil consumption story looks like, and whether anyone's ever mentioned this test to you before a quote landed on your dash. I read all of them. And if you want the next honest breakdown like this one, the video I'm putting out next goes through the oil interval myth that's quietly wearing out engines that should be lasting past 300,000 miles, and it's worth watching before your next oil change.